Dean Martin sat in a leather booth at the Riviera Hotel, staring at a piece of paper that could have made him the richest entertainer in Las Vegas history. The contract had every clause filled in except one. Where the dollar amount should have been, there was just a blank line. And underneath that blank line, in crisp corporate letterhead, were the words, "Name your price." Across from him, Arnold Rothstein, senior vice president of MGM Grand Properties, leaned forward with the confidence of a man who believed he was about to close the deal of the century. "Write any number you want, Dean," Rothstein said, sliding a gold pen across the table. "We'll honor it. You have my word." Dean picked up the pen. He looked at the blank line. The room was silent except for the distant sound of slot machines and the soft jazz playing through hidden speakers. And then Dean Martin did something that would either secure his legacy or prove he'd lost his mind. He slid the contract back across the table without writing a single digit. "I appreciate it, Arnie," Dean said quietly, "but I'm going to need something else." To understand what happened in that booth on April 14, 1976, you need to understand what Las Vegas had become and what Dean Martin meant to the city that made him a king. By the mid-1970s, the Strip was changing. The mob was losing its grip. Corporate America was moving in with checkbooks and business degrees. Howard Hughes had bought half the town. Kirk Kerkorian had built the world's largest hotel. And suddenly, Las Vegas needed legitimacy. The new owners wanted stars, not just any stars. They wanted legends who could fill showrooms every single night, whose names alone justified the $100 dinner minimum and the $1,000 suites. They needed performers who made high rollers feel like they were getting their money's worth. Dean Martin was the last of a dying breed. Frank Sinatra was semi-retired, doing scattered dates when the mood struck him. Sammy Davis Jr. was wearing himself out, trying to stay relevant. Elvis was locked into his permanent residence at the International, slowly deteriorating behind closed doors. But Dean was still Dean. At 58 years old, he could walk onto any stage in Vegas and own the room with nothing but a cigarette, a glass of scotch, and that sleepy, knowing smile. He didn't dance. He didn't do elaborate choreography. He just sang, told jokes, and made you feel like you were the only person in the room. The casinos knew what Dean brought them. When Dean Martin's name went up on the marquee, average table minimums doubled. High rollers flew in from New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles specifically to see him. The champagne flowed, the chips stacked higher, and at the end of the night, the count room was always heavier when Dean had performed. But by 1976, Dean Martin was tired. Not physically tired, though his lungs were starting to feel the effects of 40 years of smoking. He was soul tired, exhausted by the endless cycle of shows, hotels, appearances, and obligations. He'd been performing in Las Vegas since 1957, 20 years of the same routine. Show up, sing, tell jokes, collect check, repeat. His relationship with Jean had ended years ago. His marriage to Jean had ended in 1973. His kids were grown, spread across California, living their own lives. But one of them, Dean Paul, his golden boy, was the anchor that kept Dean tethered to reality. Dean Paul Martin, 24 years old in 1976, was everything Dean had hoped he would be. A champion tennis player, a successful musician with his band Dino Desi and Billy, an actor landing steady television work, and most impressively, a captain in the California Air National Guard flying F-4 Phantom jets. Dean would sit in his Bel Air home watching television, and suddenly he'd see his son on screen in some TV movie or variety show. Or he'd read in the paper about Captain Martin flying a training mission out of March Air Force Base. And in those moments, Dean felt something he rarely felt anymore. Pride. Deep, swelling pride that had nothing to do with applause or record sales. But the Vegas schedule was killing that connection. Dean was contractually obligated to perform every Friday and Saturday night, plus most holidays. Thanksgiving weekend, Christmas week, New Year's Eve, Easter Sunday. Every major holiday when families gathered, Dean Martin was in a showroom in Las Vegas entertaining strangers. He would call Dean Paul from his dressing room. "How was your day, Captain?" "Good, Dad. Flew 2 sorties. Clean runs, no issues." "That's my boy. You staying safe up there?" Always, Dad. You staying safe down there? They'd laugh, make plans to play golf the next week, but the next week would come and Dean would still be in Vegas, and the golf game would get postponed. Again. The MGM Grand properties had been watching Dean closely. Arnold Rothstein, a former accountant who'd risen through the corporate ranks to become one of the most powerful executives in Las Vegas, saw an opportunity. The company was consolidating properties, expanding operations, and needed a flagship performer who could carry multiple venues. They'd crunched the numbers. Dean Martin generated an average of $180,000 in additional gaming revenue per show. Not ticket sales. Gaming revenue, the money people lost at tables and machines after watching Dean perform. Rothstein flew to Los Angeles in early April 1976. He called Dean's agent, a shrewd operator named Mort Viner, and said he wanted to make an offer Dean couldn't refuse. Mort, who'd been fielding aggressive offers from competing casinos for years, was intrigued. They arranged a meeting at the Riviera on April 14th. Dean drove in from Bel Air that morning. He'd performed the night before at the Riviera and planned to drive back after the meeting. No overnight stay, no lingering. That was the pattern now. Get in, perform, get out. Rothstein arrived with a lawyer and a contract. Dean arrived with Mort Viner and a glass of orange juice. Dean, I'm not going to waste your time, Rothstein said after the pleasantries. We want you, exclusively. We're prepared to make you the highest paid entertainer in the history of Las Vegas. Dean sipped his orange juice. How much we talking, Arnie? Rothstein smiled. This was the moment he'd rehearsed. He slid the contract across the table. Whatever you want. Dean looked at the document. It was professionally prepared, bound in leather, with the MGM Grand logo embossed in gold. He flipped to the compensation page. The line for annual salary was blank. No number, no range, just a line waiting for Dean to fill in his price. I don't understand, Dean said. It's simple, Rothstein explained. You tell us what you're worth and we'll pay it. The only conditions are these. You perform every Friday and Saturday night, every major holiday weekend, and you give us exclusive rights to your name and image for all our promotional materials. Mort Viner whistled low. That's unprecedented, Arnie. Dean Martin is unprecedented, Rothstein said. We did the math. Whatever number Dean writes, we'll make it back in 6 months. This isn't charity. This is good business. Dean kept reading the contract. The terms were exactly what Rothstein had outlined. 2 shows per weekend, 52 weeks per year, plus all major holidays, 4 weeks vacation, but those weeks had to be scheduled 6 months in advance and couldn't fall during peak tourist season. The contract was for 10 years, a decade of Dean Martin locked in, performing the same schedule he'd been performing for 20 years. Except this time, they wanted to own his image too. His face on billboards, his name on promotional materials, Dean Martin, the official face of MGM Grand Properties. What number did you have in mind? Dean asked. Rothstein leaned forward. We thought $3 million per year was fair, but again, if that's not enough, write what you need. $3 million per year, 1976 money, $30 million over the life of the contract, more money than Dean had earned in his entire career up to that point. Mort Viner was practically vibrating with excitement. Dean set down the contract. He looked at Rothstein, and then he asked a question that changed everything. Can I bring my son to work? Rothstein blinked. I'm sorry? My son, Dean said. Dean Paul. He's 24. Can he perform with me sometimes, open for me, or do a number or two during my set? Rothstein glanced at his lawyer, confused. Sure, Dean. I don't see why not. We can work that into the contract. And Christmas, Dean continued. I want Christmas off, non-negotiable. I don't care if it falls on a Friday or Saturday. I'm home for Christmas. Dean, Rothstein said carefully, Christmas week is our biggest earning week of the year. New Year's Eve alone. I don't care about New Year's Eve, Dean interrupted. You can have New Year's Eve, but I want Christmas Day and the day before and the day after. 3 days. To spend with my kids. The room went quiet. Mort Viner was staring at Dean like he'd lost his mind. A blank check was sitting on the table, and Dean Martin was negotiating for days off? Rothstein recovered quickly. Okay, Christmas, we can work with that. Anything else? Dean picked up the pen. He looked at the blank salary line, and then he looked at Rothstein. "I'll do 20 shows per year," Dean said. "Not every weekend. 20 shows. You pick the dates, but they can't be more than 2 shows in one weekend, and I need at least 2 weeks between each weekend. And you give Dean Paul a contract too. Opening act, fair rate, and his name goes on the marquee under mine." Rothstein's face went from confused to concerned. "Dean, I don't think you understand what we're offering here." "I understand perfectly," Dean said. His voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. "You're offering me a blank check to work myself to death for 10 more years, to miss every birthday, every holiday, every Sunday dinner, to live in hotel rooms and showrooms while my family lives without me." He slid the contract back across the table. "I don't want a blank check, Arnie. I want my life back." The silence in the booth was deafening. Rothstein looked at his lawyer. The lawyer looked at the contract. Mort Viner looked like he was having a stroke. Finally, Rothstein spoke. "Dean, you're walking away from $30 million. "I'm walking away from a prison sentence," Dean said. "I've been doing this for 40 years. I'm tired, Arnie, and I'm not doing it anymore. Not every weekend, not every holiday, not for all the money in Nevada." Dean stood up. He drained his orange juice and set the glass down gently. 20 shows per year, he repeated. 2 weeks between each show date, Christmas off. And my son gets a contract. Those are my terms. Take them or leave them. He walked toward the exit. Mort Viner scrambled to follow him, leaving Rothstein and his lawyer sitting in stunned silence. In the parking garage, Mort finally caught up to Dean. "Are you insane?" Mort said. "Do you know what you just walked away from?" Dean unlocked his Cadillac. "I know exactly what I walked away from." "They were offering you everything except what I actually wanted," Dean said. He got in the car and rolled down the window. "I'm not selling my son's childhood for a number on a check, Mort. I've already missed too much. I'm not missing any more." He drove back to Los Angeles, leaving Mort Viner standing in the parking garage, wondering if Dean Martin had just made the biggest financial mistake of his life. But something interesting happened over the next week. Rothstein called Mort. Then he called again. And again. Each time his offer got closer to what Dean wanted. Finally, on April 22, 1976, they reached an agreement. Dean would perform 20 shows per year for MGM Grand properties. The shows would be scheduled with at least 2 weeks between each engagement. He would have Christmas week off, guaranteed, no matter what day of the week Christmas fell on. And Dean Paul Martin would receive a contract to perform as an opening act with his name on promotional materials. The salary wasn't the blank check they had originally offered. It was $1 million per year, plus a percentage of merchandising and promotional revenue. Over 10 years, it would amount to roughly $15 million. Dean had walked away from $30 million and negotiated down to $15. Mort Viner couldn't believe it. Rothstein couldn't believe it. The industry couldn't believe it. But Dean didn't care what they believed, because the contract included something that didn't have a dollar value attached to it. Freedom. The new arrangement changed everything. Dean still performed in Vegas, but now he did it on his own terms. He'd fly in on a Friday, do 2 shows over the weekend, and be home by Monday morning. He had time to play golf, time to have dinner with his kids, time to watch Dean Paul on television and actually be present for it. And on Christmas 1976, for the first time in 20 years, Dean Martin woke up in his own home on Christmas morning. Not in a hotel room in Vegas, not on a tour bus, not in a stranger's guest room. He made coffee, he put on his robe. And when Dean Paul showed up at 9 a.m. with gifts and a tennis racket, suggesting they hit the courts after breakfast, Dean said yes. They spent the day together, playing tennis, eating leftovers, watching football, talking about nothing and everything. Dean didn't think about showrooms or contracts or blank checks. He just thought about this day, this time, this connection with his son. "Dad," Dean Paul said that evening as they sat on the patio watching the sun set over the hills. "Thanks for getting me that opening gig. I know you probably took less money to make it happen." Dean looked at his son, this strong, talented, brave young man who flew fighter jets and made his father proud every single day. "Captain," Dean said, using his favorite nickname for his boy, "I'd take less than nothing if it meant spending more time with you." They sat in comfortable silence, and Dean felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. The deal Dean Martin made in 1976 baffled the entertainment industry. Trade publications ran articles questioning his judgment. Agents whispered that he'd lost his nerve. Younger performers couldn't understand why anyone would turn down unlimited money. But Frank Sinatra understood. When he heard about the deal, he called Dean. "You crazy bastard," Frank said, laughing. "You actually did it. You told Vegas to go to hell." "I didn't tell them to go to hell," Dean said. "I just told them they couldn't buy me anymore." "Same thing, pal, same thing." Over the next few years, Dean performed his 20 shows per year. The shows were always sold out. The audiences loved him just as much, and the MGM Grand made their money back despite the reduced schedule. Dean Martin's 20 shows per year generated more revenue than most headliners performing 50. But more importantly, Dean had his life back. He golfed. He spent time with his children. He showed up for Dean Paul's Air National Guard promotions and ceremonies. He was present in a way he hadn't been for decades. And every Christmas, without fail, Dean was home. Not because a contract required it, not because he'd negotiated it, but because he'd chosen it. In 1987, when Dean Paul's plane crashed into Mount San Gorgonio, Dean's world ended. The grief was unbearable. The loss was incomprehensible. But even in that darkness, there was a small, painful mercy. Dean had those years, the years after the deal, the years when he'd chosen time over money, presence over performance. He'd had Christmas mornings and Sunday dinners and golf games and quiet conversations. He'd had 11 years of being a father first and a performer second. It didn't make the loss hurt less. Nothing could. But it meant that when Dean sat in his living room after the funeral, staring at photographs of his son, he didn't have to wonder what if. He didn't have to carry the crushing weight of regret for time he could have had but sold for money. He'd made the choice when it mattered. He'd walked away from the blank check. And in doing so, he'd given himself something that no amount of money could ever buy back: time with the person he loved most. Friends who visited Dean in those dark years after Dean Paul's death said he kept a photograph on his mantle. It was from Christmas 1982. Dean and Dean Paul on the tennis court, both laughing, both tan and healthy and alive. The photo had been taken by Diana, Dean's daughter, during one of those Christmas mornings that Dean had negotiated for back in 1976. "That's my favorite picture," Dean told Shirley MacLaine once, pointing to the photo. "That's the one that matters." "It's a beautiful photo," Shirley said. Dean nodded. "I almost didn't have it. I almost signed away every Christmas for 10 years. Can you imagine? I almost sold that day for a number on a piece of paper." He was quiet for a moment, still staring at the photograph. "Best deal I never made," he said finally. The entertainment industry remembers Dean Martin as one of the greatest performers who ever lived, the king of cool, the man who made it all look effortless. But those who knew him best remember something else. They remember the moment he chose his son over a fortune, the moment he walked away from unlimited money because he understood something that Vegas never could: that blank checks can buy you everything except what actually matters: time, presence, connection, love. Dean Martin sang about love for 40 years, but on April 14, 1976, in a leather booth at the Riviera Hotel, he proved he understood it. He proved that love isn't something you sing about between shows, it's something you show up for. Even when it costs you everything, especially when it costs you everything. Years later, a journalist asked Dean if he regretted walking away from the MGM blank check. Dean was in his 70s by then, tired and weathered, carrying the weight of his grief like a stone. "Regret it?" Dean said, almost laughing. "That's the only thing I did right." He looked out the window of his Bel Air home, toward the tennis court where he and Dean Paul used to play. "You can't buy back Christmas morning," Dean said quietly. "You can't buy back the time you lose. They offered me all the money in the world, and I chose something better." "What's that?" the journalist asked. Dean smiled, that same sleepy smile that had charmed the world. "I chose to be there. And in the end, that was the secret deal. Not a negotiation about money or shows or image rights. It was a deal Dean made with himself, to stop performing his life and start living it, to stop collecting checks and start collecting moments." The blank check sits in a vault somewhere, probably. A curiosity, a piece of entertainment history, the contract Dean Martin refused to sign. But somewhere in that same vault of memory, there's another image. More valuable, more real. A father and son on a tennis court on Christmas morning, both laughing, both present, both exactly where they needed to be. That's the deal Dean Martin made. And unlike every other deal in Vegas history, that one paid off in something that actually mattered.